Okay, so Shvua Tov, good morning. And today we will learn the Parsha of Vaeira. In the Parsha, we learn about the process of liberation where Moshe Rabbeinu confronts Paroi and he demands that he release the Jewish people. But of course, we know that Paroi is quite obstinate and stubborn and refuses to let the Bnei Yisrael go. And he is then punished with the 10 makas, the 10 plagues, about which we learn in this week's Parsha about 7 of them, and the remaining 3 we learn about in the Parsha of Vaeira. Now, today we're going to sort of look at the big picture and assess the very notion of Paroi and the Egyptians being punished by Hashem for their stubbornness and exactly why and how could they be punished. So the big question that is asked, and we see this in a bit in the Parsha, that Paroi initially is asked by Moshe Rabbeinu, please let the Bnei Yisrael go. And he says no. But Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu that he will harden the heart of Paroi and he will not and refuse the Bnei Yisrael to go. And the question is asked, how is it possible then to punish Paroi if the hardening of his heart was caused by Hashem? So it was something that was beyond his control. And therefore, it doesn't make sense that one should punish him for that. And this is not just an abstract question that we're going to ask. Why a few thousand years ago, there was a king, his name was Paroi, and he refuses to let the Jewish people go. And Hashem hits him, smites him and his entire nation with these miraculous plagues. But really, this could inform us today in 2021, which this is the last class we would imagine for the year of 2021. So what exactly is the lesson? What is it teaching us? Perhaps we can say that each and every one of us sometimes find ourselves in a predicament which we can glean from this story, where Paroi seemed to be in a situation that would perhaps be beyond his control. Hashem was hardening his heart, and yet he is held accountable. And he could not say, hang on a second, this is not my fault. This is beyond my control. We nevertheless hold him responsible for his actions. Perhaps this can teach us a lesson where sometimes we find ourselves in a situation that we think is beyond our control. We're not in the right environment or in the right from the right background, from the right upbringing. And yet we will say that we are accountable, we are responsible for our actions. So that's sort of the guiding light, so to speak. That is the path forward, which we will seek to approach today. Now, before we get into exploring that idea, we have to take a step back. And perhaps it might be a little philosophical, but we definitely do have to ask the question, because this question about Hashem hardening the heart of Paroi really goes back to one of the great questions that were posed by the great medieval philosophers in the Rambam and the Ravid and other commentators of the Torah who discuss this issue. And it starts with the concept of Hashem's knowledge and our ability to choose, the freedom of choice. And that is like this. It's known that there is a principle, an axiomatic foundational principle in Torah, that every single person has the freedom to choose. Bechira, as the Hebrew term is known. The Rambam writes in the laws of Teshuvah that every single person is given the ability to decide and to choose what kind of life they want to be. Do they want to be a tzaddik? Do they want to be a rasha? Because if it is decreed and it is the divine design that this person should be righteous and this person should be wicked, then in what way can we understand that there's a Torah which commands and tells us to do this and not to do that? And if one doesn't do something or one does do something they shouldn't be doing, they get punished. And if they do something that they should do, they get rewarded. That makes no sense because it was already decided, it was decreed. Therefore, the notion of reward and punishment would not seem to be applicable. And the Rambam says this is to negate the idea that the notion that many in the world think, that everything is determined and there is this deterministic, fatalistic view that a person was born with a certain mazel, a certain zodiac, and a certain time, and that determines who you are and what you will become. So that is the fundamental principle. Every person has bechira chafshis, every person has freedom of choice. But the question is that Hashem knows everything that will be. So if Hashem knows what will be, it's already known whether you're going to be, he knows if you're going to be a tzaddik, if you're going to be a rasha, if you'll live a pious, righteous life, or the opposite, chas v'shalom. So if that is the case, how is it possible that we have choice? So the answer is, briefly, we're not going to get into the entire philosophical discussion, but for the purposes of this discussion, we'll say that Hashem's knowledge does not interfere with our actions. It's almost like if a person were to be watching a game, right? They watch a hockey game, and you see, you know the score, and then there's the people who are playing. Your knowledge of what the outcome is not going to impact that person, because that person already you may know if the person will score or not, and you're watching it afterwards. But that person in isolation, but their actions is not impacted by your knowledge. So Hashem, he is watching this whole story, he's watching the whole game. He knows what the score is going to be in the end. But we are not impacted by that knowledge. So that's a very basic explanation. However, why is this relevant to our discussion in this week's Parsha? Because the question here, the Rambam raises. He raises this question and others raise it as well. If we would just talk about an abstract knowledge, Hashem knows what the outcome will be. That's one thing. So he knows whether you'll be a tzaddik or not, but you don't know about Hashem's knowledge. So Hashem's knowledge doesn't impact you because you have the choice. Do you want to be the tzaddik? Do you want to help that person with their groceries or not? That is your prerogative. However, there seems to be instances where Hashem didn't just know about something, he decreed something. And that goes back to the Bris Bein Absarim, by the covenant of parts. Hashem told Avram there's going to be a time that the Jewish people will be enslaved. They're going to go to Galus. There'll be a nation that will enslave them and will oppress them. This was referring to the time that Jewish people would be enslaved in Mitzrayim. So it would appear Hashem decreed that the Jewish people must go into Galus and they need to be subject to slavery. If so, Hashem didn't just know about the fact, it was something that was decreed and had to be this way. And if so, how can Hashem punish the Egyptians with all the makos, with all the plagues, if it was divinely decreed that that is how it has to be? In fact, as the Ramban, Nachmanides in Parshas Lech Lecha, when it mentions this decree of Hashem by the Bris Bein Absarim, he says, not only should they not be punished, they should be rewarded. It's a mitzvah. They were told to oppress the Jewish people, so they fulfilled the mitzvah. Why and how could they be punished? So the Rambam, Maimonides, who, by the way, his yahrzeit was on Friday, the 20th of Tevis, he says that his answer to this question is that it wasn't a decree. The decree wasn't that this or that person should do it. It was decreed that the Jewish people would be oppressed by this nation. Now, every single Egyptian, there wasn't an individual decree who should do it. So each person could say, well, I'm not doing it, let someone else do it. So each Egyptian could absolve themselves of the decree by passing the buck to somebody else. So therefore, Hashem never decreed which Egyptian would have to subject the Jews to slavery. And the fact that this person did it, even though they weren't commanded to do so, that is the reason they were punished. That's the Rambam's answer. There are some that say that the Hashem actually never clearly said which nation it would have to be. It could have been Assyria, it could have been Persia, there could have been other nations that would subject, and therefore there was no mitzvah for the Mitzrayim to subject. But the Rebbe explains that answer is not satisfactory, because at that time Paroi was the Moshel Bekipa. He was the ruler of this. He was the superpower of the day, and therefore there was no other conceivable nation that would be able to carry out this decree. And certainly the fact that the Jewish people found themselves in Mitzrayim through the whole events from Yosef and the slavery and being sold as a slave and the Shvatim and Yaakov all coming to Mitzrayim, this is where they were. So that answer, to say that it didn't have to be the Mitzrayim, it would appear that it was indeed the Mitzrayim that were supposed to do it. But the Rambam is merely saying that there was no individual command on each Mitzri. Each one could have said, well, not me, I'm not doing it, and they passed the buck to somebody else. The problem with that is the Ravid, Rabbi Avram ben David, who has the glosses on his commentary on the Rambam, he asks the question, Rambam, I don't understand. You're saying that each individual Mitzri could say, not me, and the other guy would say, not me, but somebody had to do it. So at the end of the day, someone from this nation, from the Egyptian nation, would have to come along and carry out the decree to subject the Jewish people to the oppressive slavery. So why and how? Still, we have to answer the question, how could the Egyptians be punished for subjecting the Jews to slavery? And the truth is, it's not just about the Mitzrayim. The question is truly on Paroi, because Paroi, nothing could happen without his say-so. As we mentioned before, he was the Moshel Bekipa. He was the superpower of the king of Egypt. Was the superpower of the day, and he ruled the entire world. So nothing would happen without his say-so. And further, we see in the Talmud tells us in the Gemara and Sota that how did they get the Jewish people initially to become slaves? Just a few short while earlier, they had Yosef, and Yosef was the second in command, and they were doing very, very well. They were very powerful and influential. How did they become subject to slavery? Because Paroi slowly was able to convince them and persuade them. He himself said, well, look, we're all in this together, right? It's a term we become very, very familiar with. Paroi said, we're all in this together. We're building Pisaim and Ramses. And he went and he had this, the Talmud says he had this brick that he had on him, on his shoulder, and he was working with them. And they said, well, the king is working, so we're going to work with him. And slowly but surely, he was able to get everyone to join the labor force, to start doing this manual hard labor. And slowly but surely, that is how they descended into slavery. So Paroi was very, very much instrumental, single-handedly, in carrying out the slavery. So the question is, though, if we could blame also the Egyptians, which is it's a fascinating question. Many of the Egyptians could say, hang on a second, we were just following orders, right? There was the famous Nuremberg trial that happened in the 1960s, where that individual who was on trial, his legal defense was that I was just following the superior orders. I was just a cog in a wheel in a great machine, and therefore you can't hold me responsible for my actions because I was just following orders. And it took a tremendous legal effort by the prosecution to prove that this individual wasn't just following orders, but it was something that he was doing with his own initiative, and it was his own enjoyment, etc. But it's interesting, in the Torah, there's a concept of ein shliach ladvar Vaeira. That is to say, it is when we, in general, there's a concept of agency. We're able to appoint people to do things on our behalf. You want to betroth a woman, you could, the man could send someone to be Makadish, to betroth on his behalf. We say you're a shliach, etc. And in many, many other instances. But when it comes to doing an Aveira, generally speaking, we say ein shliach ladvar Aveira. There is one exception, Me'ilah, but we're not going to get into it. But generally speaking, if you tell someone to do an Aveira on your behalf, we don't associate the actions of the agent, of the shliach, to the sender, to the mishaleach. Rather, we say, you did it, you're going to suffer. Why? One of the reasons the Talmud says is because divrei harav, the divrei hatalmud, divrei mishayman. When it comes to following orders, who are you going to listen to? To the student or the teacher? Yes, somebody told you to go and do X, to do some Avera. Very nice. That's the person is just a Talmud. But you had someone else you had to listen to. You had someone who was far more superior, the teacher, Hashem. And therefore, you can't say, I was following his orders. Why weren't you following your teacher's orders? And therefore, we say, ein shliach l'davar Vaeira. So the Mitzrayim couldn't come along and say, well, we were just following orders. This is what Pari says, because if it was fundamentally wrong, if it was something that there was that what you were doing was immoral, there is no excuse. So, but going back, just to circle back and just to summarize, in case we lost the plot over here, we had a question. If Hashem knows everything, if Hashem knows something and you don't know about it, that his knowledge doesn't impede on your actions. But the question is, by the Bris Bein Absarim, seemingly Hashem decreed that the Egyptians should subject the Jews to slavery. So if that was the decree, that does impede on their choice. So how did the Egyptians have a choice? If they had no choice, why were they punished? They were merely following Hashem's orders. So we answered, the Rambam answered that each Egyptian, there was no command on individuals, it was just on the nation. So each individual Egyptian could shirk responsibility and say, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to be the one who's going to pull the trigger. And therefore, the fact that they did do it wasn't because of Hashem's decree. They did it because they wanted to do it. And therefore, they were punished. Ravid disagrees. He says that at the end of the day, somebody from the Egyptian nation had to do it. And therefore, the fact you can't say, well, each one should have absolved themselves of responsibility, that doesn't make sense. So he has another explanation. He says that Hashem merely said that the Jewish people will be enslaved and they will be oppressed. However, the Egyptians took it to a whole new level. What they did, they didn't just oppress the Jewish people and they subject them to what we would call normative slavery. It was inhuman, the cruelty, the butchering, the slaughter, the throwing the baby boys into the Nile River, and killing, slaughtering infants so pirates be able to bathe in their blood. That level of inhumane torture and savage suffering, that was something that went beyond the pale. That was beyond what they were commanded to do, and therefore they were punished because of that savage brutality. That is why they were punished. This is the explanation of the Ravid. However, the Rambam doesn't say that. So the fact that the Rambam doesn't give the explanation of the Ravid, we must assume that the Rambam holds that no, the Egyptians were within the line. The fact that they punished that the Jews suffered so cruelly, they weren't punished because of their savagery, because of their brutality, because the Rambam then could have given that answer. So the question is, according to the Rambam, indeed, why were the Egyptians punished? At the end of the day, every single Egyptian could say, well, I'm doing what Hashem commanded. So what's the explanation of the Rambam? So we have a fascinating teaching of the Alter Rebbe in Tanya. He says like this, there's a statement in the Talmud, Kol hakoes ki'ilu oved avodah zarah. Any person who becomes angry, who loses their temper, it's as if they have served idols. It's as if they became idolaters, idol worshippers. What is the reason? Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya that when a person is angry, when they are full of rage, what happens is at that time their emunah, their belief in Hashem, departs from them. They lose their sense of faith. How do we know that? Because if you really believed in Hashem and everything that happens in this world is hashgacha pratis, by divine providence, then you would never be angry. Because ultimately, no matter what happened, let's say a person came over to you. This is what the Alter Rebbe says. A person, a Baal Bechira, a person who has choice, and they come and they curse you. They hit you. They cause you damage and suffering. You're going to say, I should be angry. This person just insulted me. This person just damaged my property. And we get very, very angry. You know why you got angry? You got angry because you think that what happened right now was due to the choice of this person. So Reuven comes over to Shimon and starts hitting him. He comes and throws a rock at his window. He punctures his tire, right? So you get very, very angry at Reuven. Why did you do that to me? But the Alter Rebbe says what's happening here is you're losing faith. You're losing perspective. Because yes, you have to know, and this is the term the Alter Rebbe uses, al hanizak kvar nigzar min hashamayim. Al hanizak, on the damaged one. That is Shimon, the person who was beaten or damaged. It was already decreed in heaven that this is going to happen to you. If you believe that everything happens in this world is due to hashgacha pratis, Hashem truly runs the world. So therefore, you have to believe that that rock in your window was destined to be, it was meant to be. Hang on a second. But we know that everyone has free choice. Everyone has bechira. So Reuven came and threw the rock at Shimon's window. Are you going to tell me that that was meant to be? That was Reuven's choice. And if Reuven didn't have a choice, are we going to say people don't have free choice? So the Alter Rebbe says, no, this is how it works. On Shimon, it was designed and decreed that his window would break. But Reuven can't come along and say, you see, what I just did was a mitzvah. Shimon's window had to break. I threw the rock at it. Therefore, I'm absolved. No. The answer is, harbe shluchim lamakam. There are many, many agents, many, many possible ways that Hashem could fulfill and realize what is meant to be. That is to say, Shimon's window had to break. But who said it had to be Reuven? It could be somebody else. It could have happened in a myriad of possibilities. The fact that Reuven decided of his own volition to proceed to take this rock and smash Shimon's window, that is Reuven's choice. That does not absolve Reuven of his responsibility. So therefore, when Reuven observes that his window is broken, you have two choices. You could look at Reuven and say, Reuven, I am angry at you. You could feel your rage and your total hatred at Reuven for breaking your window. That's one reaction. But what that does is that fails to take into account that everything in this world is divinely ordained. So now Shimon is looking at the wrong person. What's supposed to happen is, if you really truly at that moment believe in Hashem, you believe that everything was meant to be. Reuven broke your window. That's between Reuven and Hashem. What he did was an Vaeira. But the way Shimon should look at it, the person who was wronged, he should believe in Hashem that this was meant to be. Thus, the Alter Rebbe concludes, Kol hakois, kilo oved avodah zarah. This is the meaning when the Talmud says, if you get angry, you're serving idols. Because the fact that you're angry at this moment, this is because you're not truly believing. You've detached yourself from a reality which knows that everything in this world is in alignment with Hashem's will. So you're like an idol worshiper. But what's the takeaway from this teaching of the Alter Rebbe and Tanya? That there are two realities. There is the reality of Reuven, the person who is holding the rock in his hand. And he decides, for whatever reason, whatever Shimon did to him, he thinks that Shimon's deserving of a rock in his window. That's Reuven's choice. That has nothing to do with Shimon. That has nothing to do what he deserves or what he doesn't deserve. That is his choice. And on this, Reuven has to answer for it. And he gets punished for it because that was his own independent choice. As far as Shimon is concerned, yes, he was supposed to get a rock in his window, but it didn't have to be Shimon. It could have come from somebody else. It could have come some other way. Hashem could figure it out. He doesn't need Reuven to fulfill his wishes, his decrees, or his desires. And therefore, Shimon, he should take this whole thing nonchalantly. Not an easy thing, but if you really work on your emunah and your consciousness of Hashem in every aspect of your life, you'll say, you know what? This was meant to be. Zolzaina kapara. This is what was supposed to happen. We could take this teaching and we apply it to the scenario of Paro, the Egyptians, and the Jewish people. Yes, and this is what the Rambam is saying. What does he mean to say that every Egyptian can say, well, it doesn't have to be me, it could be somebody else? What he's trying to say is something a lot deeper. He's saying is, yes, indeed, the Jewish people was decreed upon them by the Bris Bein Absarim that they would be oppressed. They would be enslaved. However, that is what Hashem decreed. But who said it had to be the Mitzrayim? Hashem could have figured another way. There could be other possible avenues and channels and vehicles, conduits through which Hashem's decree would be realized and achieved. The fact that the Egyptians did it wasn't because they wanted to fulfill Hashem's decree. They did it because of the rishus, because of the wickedness in their hearts. And the same thing is with Paro. They did it not to fulfill a mitzvah. The Or Chaim says that Hashem knew what was going through the minds of the Egyptians. They weren't doing to fulfill a mitzvah. They were going on this special holy mission to fulfill the decree of Hashem by the Bris Bein Hatzar. They were doing it out of the absolute cruelty and wickedness, ruthlessness, and therefore they deserve to be punished. Now, taking a step back, and let's just summarize this. We had the question, if Hashem knows everything, do we have freedom of choice? Especially in a scenario where Hashem gives a decree. He decrees that something has to happen, so it seems to be inevitable. And therefore, that does seem to coerce and compromise a person's free choice. The Rambam gave an answer that the Egyptians, each one could have said, not me, I won't be the one to fulfill it. Ravid says that they were punished because they went beyond what was required. So they only had to do a minimal amount of slavery, but they were mahadir, they were machmir, and therefore they went beyond what was not just required, but was even fathomed or conceived, and therefore they deserve to be punished. The Rambam, in the way the Rebbe explains it based on the Alter Rebbe, is that true, the Jewish people it was decreed that they should be punished, but the Egyptians, they didn't have to be the ones to do it. They didn't have to be Hashem's tool. Hashem could find another tool, another avenue. They did it because they despised and loathed the Jewish people, and they relished the cruelty and the brutality, and that's why they were punished. Now, if we go back to the Parsha, we find a fascinating thing. And going back to our original question, that Hashem hardened the heart of Paro. It would seem that the hardening of his heart was another step where he removed the freedom of choice. It's interesting that when you look at the Makos in this week's Parsha, the first 5 Makos, it does not discuss at all the divine intervention into Paro's heart. After the Makkah of Dam, Sfardeya, Kinim, Arov, it doesn't say that Hashem hardened his heart. It just says, Loshama Aleim Pari didn't listen to Moshe, he didn't listen to the words of Hashem. It seems to indicate the wickedness in Paro's heart. He was wicked. The first time it says that Hashem, Vayechazek Hashem Eslev Paroi, it's in the 6th Makkah of Shchin, and subsequently, Bara Dever Arbe Choshek Machshek B'Choros, we find that Hashem hardens his heart. So what do we see from this? We see this idea, and it's mentioned in the Rambam, that a person could actually lose that ability to choose freely. That is to say, once Pari began to oppress and to and began to brutalize and to murder the Jewish people, Hashem decided to take it to a whole new step. That is to say, Paro has only himself to blame the fact that he lost his freedom of choice. That is to say, generally speaking, when a person goes through a difficult challenge, you have the ability to choose good, to choose bad. When you want to choose good, Hashem actually gives you the strength, the koach, to be able to overcome your struggles. As some explain, it's not that Hashem took away his bechira, some miraculous thing. Hashem removed his ability to choose freely. Rather, it was a natural consequence of his actions. Actions have consequences. And what happened here, that Paro ultimately became numb to his inner consciousness, to his inner feelings of guilt or remorse. When a person does something once that they shouldn't have done, they feel guilty, they feel contrition, remorse. They do it a second time, they feel bad, but now they're feeling bad a little less. On a third time, now they're already not starting to feel bad, but they're worried. Other people may criticize, they may say something. By the time you reach the fourth and fifth time, now you're totally numb. You're totally oblivious to the consequences of what you're doing. And you actually right now feel totally what you're doing, there's nothing wrong with it. And this is what happened. There were 5 plagues through Dam, Tzvardeya, Kinim, Arav, Dever. What happened is that Paro, he's doing one bad thing and he does another bad thing and another bad choice. Ultimately, all these choices, they add up to a consequence where now he has become totally numb to the significance of what he's doing. And therefore, what do you mean that he took away his choice? No, he took away his own free choice, because now, what are you going to do? We see a very, very powerful lesson here that a person always needs to reckon and take into account that at a certain point, all the actions and all the choices that you make, it will be very, very hard to reverse. Ultimately, a person's choices do have actions. All the person's choices do have consequences. But there's a deeper layer here for sure. And that is to say that the fact that Hashem, we asked the question, Hashem decreed on Paro, he decreed on the Egyptians that the Jewish people should be oppressed. How could you punish them? So there's one of the explanations that are given on this is, we know there's a law when it comes to prophets, a Navi, and we want to ascertain, is this Navi a Navi Sheker or a Navi Emes? Is this a true, genuine prophet, or is this a charlatan and an imposter? So generally speaking, this person doesn't have to, the Rambam says in the laws of Yesod Torah, the foundational principles of the Torah, this person doesn't have to perform miracles. Rather, they have to come along and predict about something that will be in the future. If that matter comes to pass, we know that this person is a Navi Emes. If it does not come to pass, then we know this is a Navi Sheker, it's a false prophet. However, the Rambam says, this does not apply when it comes to predicting perennios, catastrophe, punishment. If the Navi predicts that something bad will come to pass and it does not come to fruition, this is not an indication that he is a false prophet. Why is that? Because when it comes to punishment, it is possible that it could be reversed. So here, we have this fascinating concept. The fact that Hashem predicted or decreed, and this was a decree that wasn't just nobody knew about. Hashem told it to Avram at the Bris Bein Absarim, who told his son Yitzchak, who Yitzchak would have told his son Yaakov and Esav. So the story got out. The Edomites heard about it. The Mitzrayim knew all about this oppression of the Jewish people that was supposed to take place. But just because Hashem decreed it doesn't mean it had to happen. Because when it comes to something that is negative, that's something that is of a catastrophic nature, it can always be reversed. And therefore, Parai should have known, not only pertaining to the Jews, but also about himself. The very fact we're saying that Hashem hardened his heart, and nevertheless he is punished. What does this teach us? That Parai himself could have changed. The very fact that Hashem is punishing him and at the same time hardening his heart, that teaches us that even Parai, in such a predicament, if he truly wanted, he could have changed. He could have changed course for the better. We see the fascinating story in the Talmud, in Chagiga, about Elisha ben Avuya, who is known as Acher. The one story we read about a great sage who became an apostate, who gave up and left the path of Torah mitzvahs. And the story tells us about he had a student whose name was Rabbi Vaeira, and there were once on Shabbos, you have Rabbi Vaeira, and he's with his teacher Acher, and he's on a horse. And nevertheless, Rabbi Vaeira, even after his teacher totally gave up everything, he still would want to learn from him and gain and glean from his teachings. And as they're walking and discussing words of Torah, Acher, he's on his horse and he stops. He says, "Go back, because I've counted the paces that we've been walking, and now we're at the Tchum, and we're not allowed to proceed further because you would be violating the Shabbos." And when Acher uses the term to go back, Rabbi Meir says to him, "You too, Rebbe, you should go back," meaning not just physically, but figuratively, psychologically, you should go back to your roots, do teshuvah. And his teacher Acher tells him, "I'm sorry, I can't, because I was once roaming in the ruins by the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the ruins of the temple, and I heard a voice, a bas kol, which said, 'Shuvu banim, return, return, O sons, chutz mei Acher, except for Acher.'" So there's this divine decree which says everyone could do tshuva except for me. And the story goes that according to there's different versions. Some say in the end he did do tshuva. Many other versions say that in fact he didn't do tshuva. In the end he was punished. And the question is asked, hang on a second, you're going to punish Acher because he didn't do Elisha ben Avuya, because he didn't do tshuva? Here you have this bas kol, a divine voice that is proclaiming that everyone can do tshuva except for Acher. And the way the explanation that's given according to the Maharshal, one of the commentators, he says, you know what? Actually, the story teaches you that the fact that Elisha was punished, this indicates to us that no, he could have done teshuva. Just because there was this voice, there was this bas kol that says you can't do teshuva, that is just an excuse. You should have not have taken that as a reason not to do teshuva. Many of us grow up in environments, we have upbringings, we're a place where we say, you know, this is who I'm meant to be. I had this teaching, I went to this school, I had these friends, I can't do teshuva. I find myself in an environment, I go to work, there's no kosher, there's no Jewish people, and therefore I'm absolved because what am I supposed to do? Nature versus nurture, this is my environment, and I can't change. And what this teaching from the story of Acher, from the story of Parai, that Parai was punished for not sending the Jewish people out of Mitzrayim, despite all the choices he made and despite all of his stubbornness. The fact that Hashem punishes, that itself is an indication that ultimately it is never too late. We could always make choices. We could always decide, even if the bas kol, even if a divine voice says, you're too far gone, that's just an excuse. That's just a convenient way out. We have the ability to grab ourselves together, to take hold of our lives, take responsibility and say, I am going to do different. There's like a famous story we've mentioned in the past about Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Olav Shalom. He speaks about when he was a young boy, a young student, and he went to, he was touring the United States, and he was exploring many deep philosophical questions, and he was interviewing many great leaders. And one of them, he went to the Rebbe, And when he comes to the Rebbe, he wants to ask the Rebbe questions, and all of a sudden the Rebbe turns the table and starts asking him questions. What are you doing in the university? What are you doing for Jewish life and to make things better over there? And he's totally flustered, and he says, Rebbe, in the situation that I find myself in, I can't. And the Rebbe says, my father-in-law always said, a Jew never finds themselves in a situation. You put yourself in a situation. And if you could put yourself in one circumstance, you could take yourself out and put yourself in another circumstance. It's only if you want what you truly desire. So you never find yourself in a circumstance. You never are stuck in a certain way of life. We could ultimately decide who we want to be, how we want to be. So in summation, what we have here is the story of the Makos, Mitzrayim, the plagues of Egypt. And we ask the question, why are we punishing these Egyptians? It seems that it was already decreed this way. And especially Paro, where Hashem not only decreed that they should be punished, here he goes and he hardens the heart of Paro. So we have an explanation of the Ravid that they did more than that was necessary. We have the explanation of the Rambam that true, the Egyptians, the Jewish people were meant to be oppressed, but that was between them and Hashem. Hashem was decided they should be oppressed, but the Mitzri, they decided to do it. They didn't have to be the agent of Hashem. Hashem could find many ways to do it. And we see this idea that when we believe in Hashem, when we are connected to the divine reality, then everything that happens to us, we realize every person is merely a messenger of Hashem. But if you're standing in the shoes of the Mitzrayim, you can't make that cheshbon, you can't make the calculation. You can't say, look, I'm doing a mitzvah. What's the proof? Because the fact that the rock went into that guy's window is a proof it was meant to happen. Yes, that is Shimon, that is the recipient's perspective, or should be their perspective. But from the messenger, you're not Hashem's messenger. If you were supposed to be Hashem's messenger, Hashem could have found somebody else. You need to take responsibility. And then we spoke about this idea of choices. That Paroi, the fact that his heart became hardened after many, many bad choices, we see in life that all of our deeds, all of our actions, we should think about them, because ultimately, over time, they begin to accumulate and can have a very negative, deleterious effect on ourselves. And therefore, actions and choices have consequences. And finally, we have this idea of the fact that Hashem punishes Paro, even though Hashem hardened his heart, teaches us the power of teshuvah, the power of choice that each and every one of us have, that no matter what, even if it seems that we are in a place in life and we seem to be stuck and we seem powerless, like Paro, how could he even change anything? Hashem is hardening his heart. But the very fact that he is punished indicates a level of culpability, a level of responsibility, that no matter where you are, you could one day, at any time, make a choice, make a decision, and resolve to be different, to improve yourself, and to improve the people around you. That be Hashem's will, that through each and every one of us taking responsibility to improve ourselves and those around us, we should merit to the leaving of Mitzrayim, the physical Egypt, the gullus that we find ourselves in, and we go towards Eretz Yisrael, Ira Kodesh, the coming of Mashiach, B'mher V'neinu, Amen.